Chuck, it's great to see you today.
Great to see you, Jason.
So, Chuck, you were squadron leader in the Navy SEAL Team 6. And more than that, you've been advising on national security now for years, and you're following what's going on within Ukraine, particularly since the full scale invasion. You've every day been giving updates. And what I see going on right now looks pretty interesting. It seems that Ukraine has assassinated yet again senior leaders in the Russian military. What have you heard?
Well, we're dealing within the framework, and people realize this, of course, of a totally asymmetrical conflict. In terms of volume of fire, what the Russians can shoot at the Ukrainians is always going to be greater than what the Ukrainians can return fire for the Russians. Ergo, the Ukrainians need to find high value, lucrative targets. And in the last 48 hours, we've seen the technical term for this is Ukraine interdicting the command, control, and communication nodes of the Russian army. If you don't want to deal with war college talk, that means they knocked off Major General Mikhail Gudkov, who is a naval infantry, a Marine Corps general, who was also a deputy commander of the Russian Navy, and he was in charge of all the Navy's coastal defenses and land forces, meaning commandant of the Marine Corps. And what's very interesting is that he was killed in a precision strike on a Russian field headquarters in Kursk. So again, the Russians will tell you Kursk has totally been retaken. In fact, it has not. And the fact that a very, very senior Russian commander was this far forward, we'll get into why a senior officer like that wasn't in the Pentagon, but was out front. And that reason is not so good either.
And it's not just this incident. There's been an entire slew of flag officers of Russia who have been killed by the Ukrainians. Have you been following that?
Yeah, absolutely. And so these commanders, again, micromanagerial, top down, have to get close to the zero line, but they're not safe even when they're back at home base. So on the 2nd of July in Crimea, Vice Admiral Akhmetov, who is the Black Sea commander, was killed in what the Ukrainians are calling an intelligence and sabotage operation in occupied Crimea. So this guy got up in the morning and thought he was going to work, but he didn't quite make it. We don't know how he perished at this point. My likely surmise is that it was a vehicle-borne explosive device, but we'll have to see. And Vice Admiral Akhmetov joins Admiral Viktor Sokolov, also a former Black Sea commander, who the Russians still claim is alive, but you and I commented that his headquarters was hit right in the window by a Ukrainian drone, and the Russians actually appear to have propped his corpse up in a hospital bed and claimed he was alive. And by the way, Admiral Sokolov, no one has seen him since. The Russian army, since imperial times, has been very top-heavy in management and micromanagerial. Generally, you're not going to have a major general in any position where he can be reached by an indirect fire weapon. Also, the movements of senior officers on the battlefield, that's some of the most vital intelligence that you need to preserve, right? You want to make sure that your adversary doesn't know where your high-value targets are. So thus far in the war, Ukraine has claimed, and I think their number is closer to the truth, 22 flag officers. That means admirals and generals. The Russians claimed that only 12 were killed, but among those 12, we have two of the commanders of the Black Sea flotilla, two of them. We've got a number of generals. And during the period before Kherson was retaken, the Kherson airport is the grave of at least 5 Russian generals who maintained their presence at this very accessible target and kept getting killed again and again. And that isn't the biggest one. Some of our viewers may remember there was an attack on a field headquarters in Izium a couple years ago, and by all indications, that seriously wounded General Gerashimov, who is the head of the armed forces of Russia. Again, Ukrainian intelligence quick targeting cycle, and precision strike munitions. And they're aiming at the stars and they're getting them.
And it does seem right now that Russians have a lot to be worried about because it's not just officers being targeted. Within Russia itself, Ukraine has shown that everything can become a target. Just in the past few weeks, after Operation Spiderweb on the 1st, which destroyed a number of Russian aircraft, and 5 bases in total, if I recall correctly. There's something else. Ukraine has been striking the manufacturing of the military industrial complex of Russia. And they've hit a lot of things, including microelectronic plants. But just earlier this week, you saw that the factory in Kubel was struck. What did you see about that?
Well, this particular factory manufactured two significant Russian air defense platforms, the Tor system and also the OSA system. And the OSA is a mobile vehicle used for point and short range air defense. It's fascinating, Jason. We were talking before the show. You pointed out, look, it's amazing that Ukraine was able to hit a manufacturing plant that manufactures surface to air missile systems, and that is only going to decrease the number of surface to air missile systems Russia can use to protect its vital targets. We're already to the point where people like you and I wonder if you have a plant that is so significant to your air defense, why wasn't it more heavily defended? Why was it that the Ukrainians were able to get to that plant? And let's not put too fine a point on it. They didn't use a Storm Shadow. They didn't use a T-LAM harpoon. They literally used something that a couple of hippies developed in a basement in Kyiv and then put into manufacturing. A long-range precision strike drone, probably a Plancier, I guess. In this case, it has the range and the payload. So this was an incredibly significant strike. Maybe the media is not making enough of it, but we are.
We are certainly. And looking ahead, think about all of the attacks that are going on. What Ukraine has done that's fascinating is that it's very strategic on what it's hitting. It's just not going for any targets within Russia. It understands there's only a limited number of plants that produce very specific things. For instance, chemicals that are used in various weapons. And without those chemicals, without that specific plant that produces that chemical, there's nowhere else to get that chemical. So it's very important to have that, or the specific parts that they need for their drones or for their other weapons. By destroying those plants, it's not destroying a plant, it's cutting off the supply of weapons for Russia. And this is just incredible that the Russians can't do anything about it. We've seen time and again, they're shocked, they're outraged. Russian Telegram is filled with people who are absolutely terrified. They can't believe this is happening. And I try to describe to people what a big deal this is. Just imagine your town tomorrow, if it's always quiet and peaceful, and all of a sudden drones started regularly blowing things up. You have the realization that we're at war. Things are getting really bad. And it's having an effect. We see that people not only are terrified, but they're making economic decisions indicative of high fear. The Russian economy, speaking of which, is also a total disaster, which is putting more pressure on the population. Because now they have a fear of war, while also they realize that they're losing their incomes and that their banks are becoming unstabilized. All around, Russians are just filled with fear. And why that's important? Because ultimately, when there's support for the war, it decreases when people start to think about their own concerns first. When they say, listen, we can't afford this. We have our own problems. Why isn't our government protecting us? Putin had already said, sure, he's a dictator, but he will protect the population. He brings us stability. He brings us security. But now he doesn't bring stability nor security. The whole situation in Russia is a total mess. And now he has something new to worry about. Perhaps you saw recently that General Kelly visited Belarus and talked with the dictator there, Lukashenko. Did you follow that?
I absolutely did. I was one of those people who was not outraged by the fact that General Kelly visited. I see this as a almost brilliant geopolitical move to drive a wedge between Belarus and its patron state, Russia. And in terms of political developments, look, Lukashenko is a bloated, blood-soaked tyrant, but he isn't a fool, right? He's uneducated and dense, but he's not a fool. And he knows that his puppet strings go to the Kremlin. And should Putin lose power, Lukashenko, he needs a place to land. And I think we may see more overtures from the United States towards Belarus. There was a gesture of goodwill. A significant political prisoner was released. Belarus may want to go down this line. And to our Russian listening guests, I would like you to try to imagine Belarus acceding to NATO. Just think of that one for a moment.
Well, it's absolutely the case. Ultimately, all dictators operate in their own interests. Lukashenko is no different. And he has to look ahead. Is Putin? Nobody's really sure what's going to happen to him. But after Putin, who's going to guarantee Lukashenko's security? He should be in touch with the West, which is exactly why we saw Russian Telegram, again, going totally berserk. They were completely upset that Lukashenko was meeting with the American representative. What was behind this? What was the deal? What was he getting in return? Is this a sign that we can't count on Lukashenko any longer? But you look globally, Russia's got a lot of problems. It's running out of friends quickly. Just look at the past couple of years. We've seen within Syria, well, that regime has fallen. Assad is no more. We see that in the case of Mali. The Wagner Group left there. It's not clear what happened in the relationship between the Russian government and the government of Mali. We see in the case of Iran, it just took a major beating. The Russians weren't able to supply weapons for the Iranians, or they declined to, but they also were not able to send air defense because they didn't have sufficient air defense back in Russia. But while we see how woefully undersupplied Russia is with air defense, and the Ukrainian attacks are continuing. Globally, the situation is looking bad for Russia. And I know you've seen this on the battlefield. Reflections that the the soldiers are simply not anxious to be there. Morale is very bad, and they've done things that you've noticed recently.
Yeah, absolutely. And anyone just cursory look on at some of the combat footage that comes out of Ukraine. I'd like people to just take a look at this. Think of how many videos you have seen of a stationary Russian vehicle on the battlefield. Note number one, no attempt is made to camouflage this vehicle, right? There are axes and hatchets and shovels on every armored vehicle. That's so you can cut down trees and branches and pile them on top of your tank. The Russians don't do that. Also, notice how many times these vehicles are abandoned or left or parked with every single hatch open. Why do you think they do that? The grenade drops right in there, the vehicle blows up. Thousands, approaching tens of thousands of vehicles destroyed. They're left by their crews in this condition precisely so they don't have to fight. They don't want to drive that tank into battle. We see this again and again and again. Look, there are no coincidences on a battlefield. Something might happen once. If it happens twice, it's of your concern. If it happens three times, it is a trend. And I'll also say this is a number that has existed throughout the entire war. 100 Russian vehicles are driven to contact in Ukraine. 38% of them are abandoned by their crews before contact. That's not always running out of gas, folks. It's not always something doesn't work. A significant portion of this is people just don't want to fight, Jason. And we see the mutinies, the balking, the company representatives, the complaints, the debriefing of POWs. Morale is not a problem with the Russian army. It's a cancer.
Totally agree. It's actually sort of amazing just to look at the number of deserters. The Russian military has lost throughout this war just tens of thousands of men who signed up and then escaped. They just ran away. And in fact, it might be even larger than what we know about. There could be many, many more. How would we ever know about those who deserted while still back in Russia, didn't even make it to Ukraine? So overall, the morale is really bad in the Russian military. And the Russian forces have a reason to have very low morale. Things are bad, and they're getting yet worse every single day. What else have you noticed recently that caught your attention?
Well, I've noticed around Kremenna, this is an area where Russia traditionally has had a force differential of approximately 10 to 1. So there's 10 Russians for every Ukrainian defender around Kremenna. We've seen an uptick in surrenders, and this is all up and down the zero line, but I've got the numbers here for Kremenna. We see surrenders numbering in like 10, 15, a dozen. When you hear that number, it should click in your head. That's the size of a rifle squad. So we're often getting surrendering of entire tactical units. An entire rifle squad is going to walk out with their hands up. Well, why are they doing that? Look, the Russians are capable of really tough fighting. But if you are not fed, and first of all, you can go 3 weeks without food. Forget it. That isn't the problem. But you can't go 3 days without water. And you can't go, there's a golden hour if you're wounded that you need medical attention or you're going to die. Maybe within an hour, 2 hours, or 3 weeks, that untreated wound is going to kill you. The Russians have no medical supply. They're not getting water to their troops because it's being delivered by donkeys. So stop me if you think they're winning this war. You don't go steal somebody's donkey because your logistical system is working. Look, this is, and we've seen, and you and I spoke about this earlier. In the last 2 months, Russia has lost conservatively 60,000 men. They have gained an area equivalent to the size of Phoenix, Arizona, not the suburbs, not Mesa, not the adjoining areas, downtown, downtown Phoenix. As many people as were killed in Vietnam to gain Phoenix, Arizona. That isn't a win.
It's certainly not a win. And that's why it's so incredible to watch the total disbelief within the Russian population, I believe, when they see their president repeat this nonsense that his country has these imperial ambitions, because it's very clear to everybody that things are going just tragically not well. And I don't see a way that Russia could realistically win the war in Ukraine. That is to take Kiev. To me, it's just simply unbelievable. There's no way to believe it. But do you see any way that Russia could pull this together? Or do you think that maybe there's a big strategy that they're working on in Moscow that their generals have developed that would allow them this major victory?
No, I really don't. And look, my entire background is never to underestimate the enemy. Since I was a junior officer, I was told to assume that the enemy is smarter than you, he has more resources than you think, and his intelligence is better than yours. But I've been watching the Russian armed forces here, as you said, we both have for 3 years now. There's nobody in the Russian army who seems a general officer who seems fit to command the way generals can command. Manage resources, and your tactical element is not a rifle squad or a rifleman, it's the brigade task group. Well, Russia doesn't operate to its own doctrine, right? And how do I know this? Well, they did use brigade task group tactics in Vuhledar 1. And coincidentally, General Gudkov was the man commanding the 115th Naval Infantry Brigade. They got greased, right? They lost almost 200 armored vehicles in 2 days of fighting. Each battle was about 5 hours a day. So in 10 hours, they lost virtually everything they had. And film from that video showed me Russian Marines running across a field yelling "Ura" with bayonets, no supporting fire, no cover and maneuver, no fire and maneuver, nothing. Craziness like paintballers in Pasadena, right? And the 115th was wiped out twice in Vuhledar. That's why, one of the many reasons I say, look, Russia, they don't have a General Grant waiting to take over. They don't have General Sherman, Patton, Omar Bradley. And how could they? It takes 30 years to make general. If you're going to be a general in Putin's army, you've been a con man for 30 years, not a scholar, not a warrior, not a war fighter like General Hodges. They don't have anybody like that.
They most certainly do not have a General Hodges up their sleeve. They are very far from that. But at this point, it does look like it is getting worse and worse for Putin, as well as for his military. Just everywhere we look within Russia, whether it's socially, because the people are now in fear and chaos and panic because of the routine attacks. In fact, just look at Moscow. It seems that every single week, at least a couple times, all the airports are forced to close due to Ukrainian drone strikes. So Russia never gained air superiority in Ukraine, and today it cannot guarantee the airspace over Moscow. So talk about a change of events and a change of condition. But this was all Putin's decision to invade, totally underestimating what would occur next. But one last question to you. What is currently going on with the Russian big summer offensive? Do you see this materializing or more coming from this?
No, I really don't. And it's funny that the word offensive gets thrown around. An offensive is what General Sherman did to Atlanta and Charleston, and that's an offensive. In my considered estimation, the Russians are incapable of doing anything like that anymore. Am I underestimating the enemy? Look, Russia has been fighting, according to UK Defense Intelligence, with 95% of their military resources concentrated on Ukraine. They still haven't won this war. They still haven't. 60,000 casualties to capture Phoenix, Arizona. There is, in terms of, use the accurate terminology, Russia's summer offensive. Well, it's not a summer offensive if you conduct platoon and company sized attacks, approximately 60 or 70 of them a day. I watched them very carefully. There's no converging attacks. There are no brigade task groups maneuvering in the field. Russia's logistics have broken down. And as Napoleon has said, army travels on his belly. If you don't have beans, bullets, and band-aids, you're not a soldier, you're a homeless person. And one other thing I'll throw in here, training is a factor as well, not just the incompetence of the general officers. That's one thing. You join the army in St. Petersburg, 4 days later, you're in Ukraine. I would suggest to you that you're now an armed civilian. You're not a soldier. And it definitely shows. The other thing, in terms of burn rate, Russia recruits 30,000 people a month into the army, and 30,000 a month rather, get killed on the battlefield. That's not the math, right? That isn't going to work, Jason.
No, they've got a very serious math problem. So looking ahead, it looks like it will get worse and yet worse for the Russians. Something to look forward to. Chuck, great talking with you today.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you for having me.